Earlier this year, if you wanted a new electric car which was cheaper than most other new EVs on the market, your choice was the MG4, and that was pretty much it. But there have been huge changes at the entry point of the EV market, and right now there are lots of new competitors which are cheaper than the MG4. This is one of them, and it might be the best of the bunch. It's the Hyundai Inster, and in this review we're telling you what it's like. So Hyundai has lots of experience in the electric car world. It launched the original Hyundai Ioniq long before many other manufacturers had even thought about their first electric cars. Then it followed that up a few years later with a fully electric version of the Kona, which was launched around the same time as the Kia e-Niro, which of course is very closely related. And then it was a few years before we saw Hyundai's latest new generation of electric car products, starting with the Ioniq 5 and the Ioniq 6. But while Hyundai makes very, very good electric cars, even the cheapest version of the latest Kona electric is £35,000. This can be more than £10,000 cheaper than that. Now, we're going to dive into all those numbers properly later on, but first, what actually is this? Because if you're watching from South Korea, you might recognise this as the Hyundai Casper, which is a petrol version of this car that's been on sale over there since 2021. For this fully electric version, Hyundai has stretched the overall length of the car, and the name is also different. There's no official reason why the name has been changed, but Hyundai chose Inster not because of any association with a certain social media platform, but apparently because it's derived from a combination of the words intimate and innovative. Now, in terms of styling, this does have shades of the Suzuki Ignis about it, doesn't it? Because it's got that kind of chunky but bite-sized SUV look. There are still, though, obvious Hyundai styling cues, like this pixel design for the lights up here. And overall, this is a bit bigger than an Ignis. That car is 3.7 metres long, this is 3.8 metres long. Compared to an MG4, though, this is a lot smaller. That car is 4.3 metres long. So this is quite a small car, which might understandably have you assuming that this is terrible when it comes to practicality, but it's been very cleverly packaged. So these rear seats, the first thing to point out is that the rear doors themselves actually open almost to 90 degrees. So you have this big, easy open space to get in. It also makes it very simple if you're loading big, bulky items into the back or taking them out again. And then the space itself really is fantastic for this size of car. An adult can sit back here in great comfort. There's good amounts of legroom. Headroom is also very generous. You'd have to be over 6 foot tall to feel cramped back here, especially with these decent sized windows that let in a lot of light. There's lots of foot space under the seat in front of you and also a flat floor. Plus, these rear seats can slide and they can recline. And they go back really quite far, so you can properly lounge out and relax in the rear seats. In fact, probably the only bad thing to point out back here is the fact that there are just 2 rear seats. You can't get a 5-seat version of the Inster, it is 4 seats only. But okay, this is a small car and it's just impossible for it to have very good rear seat space and a massive boot. So as you can see, the space that you have in the boot is pretty tiny. In this position here, you've got this letterbox which you can post through a carry-on size suitcase, but not much else. However, Hyundai has still been quite clever with the packaging of the space that's available in the boot. So there are lots of different things you can do back here. For a start, this boot floor you can lift up to reveal a lot of underfloor storage. And what you can do is use this hook to attach to the rear seats to then mean that you've got even more space available to you. With this setup, we could just about squeeze in 4 carry-on size suitcases. For some electric car context, an MG4, a much bigger car, can fit 5 in its boot. So this isn't actually that far behind when it comes to outright boot space. And there's more. If you really want to maximise your loading capacity and you don't have any passengers, then you can remove this parcel shelf, which you can see is attached to the rear seats with this carpeted lining here. Unfortunately, there's nowhere to store it though. You can fold down the rear seats, and then you have a lot more space available to you, obviously. And cleverly, you've got these things on the back of the seat backs to mean that you aren't left with a big hole between the boot floor and the rear seats to make it one relatively flat loading area. And on top of all of this, you can even fold down the front passenger seat. It doesn't get a front boot though. And the flat folding passenger seat, the sliding and reclining rear seats don't come as standard, which brings us on to the trims and the batteries available with the Inster. So essentially, there are 2 batteries to choose from and 2 trim levels as well. The entry-level version of this car is the 01, and that gets a 42 kilowatt-hour battery and an official range of 203 miles. And the starting price of that car makes this one of the cheapest new electric cars around. For about £1,500 more, you can get a bigger battery with that, but it's not much bigger. And then another jump up in price gets you to this, which is the range-topping 02 version. It's only available with the bigger battery, but it brings more equipment like those fancy rear seats, cruise control, and things like heated front seats and a heated steering wheel. Whichever version of the Inster you go for, you will have an identical layout up front. But if you go for the range-topping 02 model, then you get a choice of colours, because as standard, the Inster gets a black interior, but in 02 models, for no extra cost, you can have this far brighter interior colour, which does look really nice and helps lift things in here, which is important because the actual materials used in the interior are all pretty much hard plastics everywhere. But that isn't the end of the world, because it still looks fairly attractive. And also, yes, they're plastics, but they feel like good quality plastics. And okay, an MG4 might have a bit more in the way of soft touch materials, but this looks classier. And it's also a far better interior when it comes to usability, because you can see down here, you've got loads of physical controls. And it's great that things like adjusting the temperature and the fan speed can be done very simply down here with these physical buttons, rather than having to dive into a touchscreen menu like you do in the MG4, which is far more distracting to use while you're driving. This touchscreen infotainment system is the same on both versions of the Inster, and it's a good size, it's well placed, the response time is pretty decent, and you get Apple CarPlay and Android Auto as standard. There's also this digital driver display, which looks very nice, but unfortunately for me and my driving position, the top of the steering wheel blocks a fairly big chunk of the display. But aside from that, the driving position itself is really good in the Inster. You've got a good view down to the nose of the car, decent sized door mirrors as well. This armrest is nice and luxurious up front, although it is a shame there isn't padding on the top of this armrest over here. Now, in terms of storage, there isn't one big area to chuck a load of stuff. Instead, the Inster gives you lots of smaller cubbies. So these door bins, for example, are pretty tiny, and you're not going to fit any water bottles in there, but you can still fit your wallet and your keys down there. There are another couple of small cubbies on the dashboard here. Your front passenger gets a storage tray as well, all of which is fairly acceptable for a small car like this. And generally, there are lots of things to like about this interior, particularly when it comes to usability. Right, time to drive the Inster and tell you what this is like on the road. So, we mentioned earlier there are a choice of 2 different batteries, and that also brings with it 2 different electric motors. So if you go for the entry-level smaller battery, then you get electric motor driving the front wheels, and the 0 to 62 mile an hour time is 11.7 seconds. If you go for the bigger battery, then you get a more powerful electric motor, and it drops the 0 to 62 time down to 10.6 seconds. But that is still pretty slow, to be honest, especially by electric car standards. But what it is quick enough. It can get up to motorway speeds without any fuss. It offers flexible enough performance at those speeds to be able to overtake a slow-moving lorry when needed. And it also feels nippy around town. So really, performance is fine. The ride is very good. It's got a relatively soft suspension setup, and it's impressively comfortable by small electric car standards. It's not perfect though. It can trip up over some road imperfections, and you hear some thumps and thwacks as you pass over them. But we're on the bigger of the 2 alloy wheel options available. These are 17s. There are some smaller 15-inch alloys available, and the ride might be even better with those. Because of that soft suspension setup as well, and this being a relatively tall car that isn't particularly long, there is some body lean when you go around a corner, but for the most part, things are well controlled, the steering's nicely weighted, and this is a good car to drive. We also carried out a controlled real-world efficiency test with this Inster, and the O2 version with the bigger battery that we have here returned average efficiency of 3.9 miles per kilowatt hour, which isn't amazing, but is still fairly decent. And when it comes to charging this car back up, the maximum charging rate it can accept isn't exceptionally quick, but because the batteries available with it are relatively small, you can still get a 10 to 80% top up in around 30 minutes.